Hey guys, welcome to US government. This first topic that we're going to cover is going to be just an overview of government in general, very foundational pieces that we'll reference back to as we go through some of the other topics throughout the course of the semester. So we're going to get started with 1.1, which is principles of government. So our learning targets for today, by the end of this lecture, you should be able to define government and the very basic powers that every government holds. Additionally, we'll talk about the characteristics of a state, and I'll give you a definition of what I mean by state as well in this context as we go through the lesson. We'll also talk about what we call the theories of the origin of the state. To put that into terms that are maybe easier to understand, we're going to talk about some of the theories that intellectuals have about how governments came to be. Why did people organize themselves? What sort of beliefs did they have that led to that organization? So on and so forth. And then we'll just talk about the purpose of government in the United States more specifically, as well as some other countries. So this is a course about government, and in particular, we're talking about the United States government. You are an important part of the United States, right? It's founded on this idea of we the people. And for that reason alone, I think that you should know as much as you possibly can about your own government so you can be an informed citizen, right? So you can make an informed vote so that you can be active in your community. And there's just an uncountable number of ways that the government affects you day in and day out, right? Whether that be regulations on the cost of certain items, maybe like prescription drugs, or maybe you work for the government or you receive mail from the US Postal Service, right? A million different things. But the government does have an effect on you, even if you really don't see it yet. I think as you guys get older, right? Many of you probably work jobs now. As you start paying taxes and so on and so forth, it'll become more clear to you how big of an impact our government has on you today, and it will tomorrow and for the rest of your life. So that's my plea about why US government is important, okay? Now, to get started, I want you to think about what you already know about the government in the United States. What do they do, right? How has it affected you? So on and so forth. So what have you done recently that has involved the government? Or maybe you can't really think of anything. How has the government affected someone you know, right? If you can't think of anything for yourself. And then I want you to think of at least 4 useful things that the government does for its citizens. And briefly explain to me why you think each of those things is useful. Why would you characterize that as useful? All right. So we're going to start with a definition. This is an important one because I'm going to be using the term the state as we go through the rest of this section of notes. So want to make sure we're clear. Now, when we hear the word state, we probably think of North Dakota or Minnesota or New York, right? When we're talking about the state in section 1.1 of notes, we're actually talking about a body of people living in a defined territory that's organized politically, that has the power to make and enforce law without consent of any higher authority. Now, that definition doesn't completely apply itself to what we consider a state in the United States of America, because states, individual states, cannot make all their own laws without the consent of a higher authority, right? There's federal laws that kind of trump state laws, right? So that's the difference between like what we normally think of as a state and the state that I'm referring to as we go through notes here. Now within this definition, there's 4 characteristics. These things are going to be on your topic 1 test. So keep that in mind. But we're going to look at 4 different characteristics here that make up the definition of the state. So first we have a body of people. We call a body of people a population, right? We're going to cover all of these a little bit more in depth in the coming slides, so no worries. Living in a defined territory. We have a territory, right? We have borders, a designated, recognized area. Now, to be organized politically, that's government, okay? And then with the power to make and enforce law without consent of any higher authority, that's what we call sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is probably the one term on that last slide that you maybe don't know the definition to, maybe haven't heard of, right? Sovereignty is that piece about power, right? The state has absolute power within its territory to decide its own policy, right? No one can say, hey, you can't do that. So that's going to be like, if you want a short and sweet definition of what sovereignty is, I think of it as ultimate power. You don't have to respond to anyone, right? So just a general review of those 4 different characteristics of a state: population, territory, sovereignty, and government. So we'll go through each of these one by one. So for population, large or small, every state must be inhabited. So there's got to be people there, right? If we're going to call this like a civilized state, we need people, right? Now some areas, some states are very populated, right? Think of the United States. We have like 300 plus million people in the United States, right? That's a huge state or country. I think of the state that we're talking about in this section as more synonymous with country, okay? So you have countries like the United States that are just huge in terms of population. But you also have countries around the world that are very, very small in terms of population, right? Maybe they only have like a few thousand people that live there. Maybe their country has less people than the amount of people that we have living in Fargo and West Fargo, right? There are states or countries around the world that do have small populations, and that's okay. That doesn't like disqualify them from being a civilized state, right? So this says sovereignty is one of the 4 characteristics possessed by every state in the world. Now, you can see on this map, again, we have all of the different like recognized states throughout the world that we more often refer to as countries. Now, in the United States, the question says how many sovereign states are in the United States? The answer is 1, right? Because state governments, we do have state governments in the United States, but those states don't have sovereignty, which is an essential characteristic of a state, right? Like North Dakota can make laws, but those laws are not supposed to be in violation of federal law. So federal law, our national government, is the sovereign entity, right? They're the ones who have like ultimate power. because they can tell the states, hey, no, that's against federal law, and you can't do that. Then we have territory. So, like I said, every state must have land with known and recognized borders. So we can see all of the recognized borders across the globe in this picture. And then we have government, which is the mechanism through which a state makes and enforces policy. Now, Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher, and when our founders were creating our government, they really believed in some of these ideas that these philosophers had written about during their time. Okay, and so Hobbes was one of those guys that they looked to for guidance in creating a new government. Now, Thomas Hobbes says that government is necessary to avoid the war of every man against every man. Without government, there would be continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I want you to think for a minute. Imagine you're living in the United States and there's no government, okay? Like, forget about Congress and the president and all of it, right? We might think for a second like, hey, that sounds kind of enticing. But do you think our society would become what Hobbes has said here? Like, to what degree is his statement true? What are some of the potential consequences of not having government? Think about that to yourself. We're going to talk about that one because I think it's an interesting idea. All right, so we should have thought about what Hobbes had said. Do you believe that's true or not? What Hobbes was referring to was something we call the state of nature, which is just this idea that humans are inherently selfish, right? Like, if we could do whatever the heck we wanted, whenever the heck we wanted, we would do it, right? And so he says that the solution to the state of nature, the solution to human selfishness or keeping human selfishness in check is government, is rules, right? Like, if you're super, like, hate someone so much, right? If there was no government, what's keeping you from, like, being like, I'm gonna hurt that person? Or in very severe cases, like, I'm gonna kill that person. If there wasn't government, where's the consequences for those horrible actions, right? But if we didn't have those rules, if we didn't have those consequences, maybe we would do it, right? Or be more inclined to, because we are inherently selfish. So Hobbes says that's why we need government. All right. Now, for centuries, historians, philosophers, and others have pondered this question of, like, how did states come to be, right? How did people organize themselves politically? How did they mark boundaries? All of those things, right? What major political ideas in history resulted of this emergence of states and civilized society? So we're going to go over 4 different political ideas about how states came to be. These 4 are all going to be on the topic 1 test as well. So all of them are written out here for you on the screen. We are going to flip through a few more slides about each of them, but we'll start by going through them here. So first we have the force theory. Okay, now the force theory says that an individual or a group claimed control over a territory and they forced the population to submit. So in this way, the state became sovereign, those in control controlled the government or formed the government. So they came in, took over by force, created a society based on whatever they believed in, right? I'm going to give you some examples of these in the coming slides. Divine right of kings theory. This is the idea that God created the state and he made it sovereign. He made it free. He gave it ultimate power, right? And then the government is made up of people that were chosen by God to rule over that territory. And so because God chose these people, the population must obey their ruler, or they're not obeying God, right? Then we have the evolutionary theory. So this is the one that by far is the most missed anytime I give the topic one test. So if you have questions on this, please let me know. A population formed out of primitive families. The heads of these families became the government. And then when these families settled in one area, they claimed it as their own and it became a state. So over time, kind of builds, right, and becomes a state, a more civilized state. Then we have the social contract theory, which is this idea that a population in a given territory chose to give up power to a government in order to promote the well-being of everyone. So they have this mutual agreement to create a state because they think it's going to be to the benefit of everyone. Some examples for you. So first we have the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So all of these descendants of Jacob, they occupy the area referred to as the Promised Land, and they kind of create a government or a civilized society in that area. This would be an example of the evolutionary theory. I often think of a more modern example of the evolutionary theory being like kind of the power structure on Native American reservations, right? Where historically the leaders of the family, the male heads of the household, the fathers, right, would like form a council and they would kind of make the rules for their territory. Same sort of idea. Then we have divine right of kings theory. So when we think about all of the like monarchies in like the 14 to 1600s, there were many monarchs that believed they were God sent, right? So King Louis XIV is one of those. He ruled in France in the late 1600s into the early 1700s and truly believed that he had a divine right to rule. There were many paintings done of him that kind of demonstrated this idea that he was like hand selected by God. And so this is like a powerful political idea in like the age of monarchs, really leading up to like the revolutions that happen in the 1700s, mid to late 1700s, where people start to kind of challenge this idea that one human like could be God sent, and because of that we need to follow them. This is an example of the force theory. So the German army during World War II occupied different countries, right? Took over different areas and placed them under German rule. So this is France in this picture. You can see the area of German military occupation where the Germans come in, they take over the land, and they force everyone that's already there to submit. And then we have social contract. And social contract is really the idea that the United States government is formed on, right? Same idea that Thomas Hobbes had, that like, hey, we're all in this together, and we all want to be safe and well off, and we know that we're selfish, so we're going to make rules for ourselves, and that's just an agreement amongst the people. Okay, so the modern day US is really an example of this. Now, this is very evident in writings like the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson does this whole section on like what they believe government should be. And for example, in one part of the Declaration, he says that to secure these inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving its power from the consent of the governed, right? That's social contract. All right. So, what government does? There are 3 main roles that our government plays in the United States. You can find out exactly what each of these branches do in the United States Constitution, and we're going to go through that as we go through the rest of the topic, but we're just going to do a quick overview here. So the role of the 3 branches. First, we have the executive branch. That's our president, okay? The president and all the people who work underneath him. So the executive, their job is to enforce law. Now, we don't really think of the president as the person that's like knocking on our door when we're violating a law, right? But that's what all of the people who work for them do. Then you have the legislative branch, whose job is to make laws. And then you have the judicial branch, whose job is to interpret laws. Now, there's a couple ways that you can interpret law, right? You can interpret what a lawmaker meant by writing that law, right? Kind of determining what they meant in maybe the context that it was written in, what year it was written in, right? Laws can be vague. So the courts can interpret them that way. They can also interpret whether or not a law is constitutional, right? If it falls within the powers of the federal government. And additionally, they can interpret whether or not people broke the law, right? Like, given the scenario, did that person break the law? That's the job of the courts. Now, in the United States, we have a written constitution. And this is maybe a leading question, but I do believe that a constitution, something written down, is important for governing the state. Now, whether or not you 100% agree with that or not, I want you to think about like why writing it down could be really important, right? Why is a written constitution important for governing? And then the last piece here is the preamble of the United States. This preamble may show up on your test as well. Within the preamble, which is just kind of a fancy word for introduction, we cover like the duties of the United States, okay? So the United States is founded to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, right? To create this like free and fair society, to ensure domestic tranquility, which means peace at home, to provide for the common defense, right? To keep us all safe, and to promote the general welfare, to make sure that our basic needs are met. And then finally, to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, so future generations. That is why we're writing this Constitution.